with you. And um, this is a good subject. It's a little heavy subject, if I'm being honest. I was a little bit worried when I wanted to kind of not talk about stress because we've talked about stress the last couple of times. And so I was glad to get some direction as far as maybe some people in the audience are kind of struggling with some grief and loss, especially with the COVID-19, and we may know somebody that's either struggling with it or maybe has died from it. And there's just a lot of stuff going on in the world today, and not even just with COVID-19, that could be creating some level of grief and loss. This subject, I believe, impacts everybody, right? We've all lost. I would say most of us, if not all of us, have lost something. And even if we're not maybe currently actively grieving over that thing, I think as we even talk about what I'm going to share today, it'll bring up some times or some things that we have lost and times when we have grieved. And I think that is the nature of grief. It's not about sort of getting rid of grief, or that it's something to try to avoid. It's something that on some level I believe that we have to deal with for our whole life. So when we have a significant loss, we don't just sort of overcome that thing, right? Or just leave it behind. There's a part of that that stays with us. I remember one time I went to my mother's funeral, and it was heart-wrenching. This is probably, 13, 14 years ago. And I remember that this old man came up to me, just this sweet old man. He was probably almost 90 years old. And he was just the sweetest guy. He came up to me and he said, that was a wonderful service, and I'm so glad that I got to be able to be a part of it. And it made me miss my own mom. It just touched me to the core, to hear this 90-year-old guy still had, and he said all this with tears in his eyes, how much he missed his own mom. So I think on some level, even if we've kind of moved through in some ways, our grief, it always stays with us. So I'm hoping that some of the things we talk about today can help not only those of us who might be grieving or struggle with grief, but also maybe how to help other people that might be struggling. I'm hoping there's a few things that I can say about that too. So what is grief? Well, it's pretty simple, right? Grief is a natural response to loss. It is the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. The more significant the loss, the more intense the grief will be. You may associate grief with the death of a loved one, which is often the cause of the most intense type of grief. What are some of those losses? Well, there's a whole bunch, right? I mean, there's probably less on this list, but some of the more common ones are divorce or relationship breakup, loss of health, maybe losing employment, a place we enjoyed working at, or even just a change, loss of financial stability, a miscarriage, retirement, death of a pet, loss of a cherished dream, maybe a loved one we find out has a serious illness, loss of friendship, and loss of safety after some kind of trauma. We feel a loss of feeling secure, right? And maybe even something as simple as selling the family home, something that we were very attached to. It's important here to realize that everyone grieves differently, right? There's no specific way to grieve. Grieving is a personal and highly individual experience. How you grieve depends on many factors, including your personality and coping style, life experiences that you've been through, that maybe help you have a particular perspective on things. It's always interesting to me that, what's the difference between somebody that has, you could have somebody that experience a very similar trauma, yet one person develops sort of post-traumatic stress after that event and somebody else doesn't. Well, what's the difference? I mean, that's a very complicated question, right? Some of it has to do with life experience. Some of it has to do with probably interpersonal factors, maybe even some genetics. I mean, there's just so many things involved, right? Therefore, everybody that experiences some loss or grief, how they work through that is really going to be dependent on all of those factors for that person. Your faith, that's another one. Some people, are very religious, have very strong spiritual, a strong spiritual foundation that they rely on in times of heartache or loss. Others would say they don't really have much of a faith, and so then they rely on different things to kind of help them get through that, right? And what's the nature of the loss? I guess, again, how significant it is. The grieving process takes time. Healing happens gradually. It can't be forced or hurried, and there is no, quote, normal timetable for grieving. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do think it's worth mentioning. Most of everybody within the sound of my voice has probably heard of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. So in 1969, she's a psychiatrist. She introduced what she called the 5 stages of grief. These stages of grief were based on her studies of the feelings of patients facing terminal illness, but many people have generalized them to other types of negative life changes and losses, such as the death of a loved one or a breakup. So let's just briefly review those. I think that's important. Oops, let me go back. So these were those 5 stages, right? Denial. This can't be happening to me. We're just not really willing to face the fact of the change, right? Anger. Why is this happening? Who's to blame? We try to point the finger. We can move to a bargaining stage, which is, I just don't want this to happen. Make this go away. If you'll give me this back, then I will. Sometimes, a lot of times, that might be asking God to change things for us or something. But it's just really kind of like, I guess it's a little bit in denial that it's really, things are the way they are. Then once that kind of sets in, I've always thought that it's hard to be in denial when you've lost someone, right? I mean, you can try to put it out of your mind, but the reality is you're going to be faced with the fact that that person is gone every day. And again, it could be anything. I read a story about a guy who had lost his arms in a war. And so he was, how could he be in denial that he didn't have his arms, right? He was faced with that reality every day. So, but we sometimes do that, it's kind of for some self-protection. But then we move into this area where once we realize the fact that, hey, this is gone, or this person is no longer in our lives, we can move into a place of depression and sadness, right? Where we feel pretty numb, we feel pretty incapable of doing a whole lot. And then obviously, over time and through a lot of different ways, we can move to a place of acceptance, to where we feel more at peace with that thing. It's not about, again, forgetting or moving past it. It's just about coming to a level of acceptance. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but maybe just I'll say one more thing here. Do we have to go through all the 5 stages? Contrary to popular belief, you do not have to go through each stage in order to heal. In fact, some people resolve their grief without going through any of these stages. And if you do go through these stages of grief, you probably won't experience them in a neat, sequential order. So don't worry about what you should be feeling or which stage you're supposed to be in. I can't really emphasize that enough. And I'm going to kind of share a story here in a second that I think kind of encapsulates this very well. But the reality is that although I believe that people that go through grief do experience on some level those 5 stages, or at least some of those 5 stages, they never really happen in some particular order. So I wouldn't spend time trying to figure that out or worrying what stage you're in or anything like that. I think the reality is that I think it's just good to know that it's pretty common that we all feel those kind of ways when we're trying to work through something. Common symptoms of grief: shock, disbelief, sadness, guilt, anger, fear. We may even have some physical symptoms. Does that ring true to some of you in the room when you think about how you had to deal, or are you dealing with something that you're struggling with? I think those are pretty common feelings. All right. So I'm going to do a little something different today. When I think about grief and loss, I think about a book, one of my favorite books that was introduced to me many, many years ago. And I'm going to share that book with you today. So, get your graham crackers and milk, because we're going to do a little story time. And what I want you to do is, I'm going through this story, and you can pull out a piece of paper if you'd like, because this book is very it's multi-layered. It's very simple, yet it's very deep. And so it might be kind of cool for you just to pull out a piece of paper, and as I'm reading the story to you and showing you the pictures, maybe, when you think about either somebody that you're trying to support that's struggling with grief or loss, or for yourself, what you need to do to work through grief and loss, write those things down. I think they'll be pretty clear, and then we're going to kind of review those after here. So see if you can find some key elements associated with working through grief and loss with this story. If you have seen this book before, or you've read this book before, I hope you'll still tune in, because I think I've read this book many, many times. And even as I was preparing to talk with you guys today, I found myself getting even a little emotional while I was reading it again for the probably, who knows, 50th time. So it's called Tear Soup. I would encourage you guys to get this book if you find it as helpful as I have found it to be, either sharing that with somebody or using it for yourself. All right, let's do this. There once was an old and somewhat wise woman whom everyone called Grandy. She just suffered a big loss in her life. Pops, her husband, suffered the same loss, but in his own way. This is the story of how Grandy faced her loss by setting out to make tear soup. For many years, the custom of making tear soup had been forgotten. As people's lives became more rushed, they found it much easier to pull soup in a can from the shelf and heat it on the stove. But several years ago, Grandy got a taste of a well-seasoned tear soup. One of her friends made it from scratch after her child died. As soon as Grandy tasted the rich flavor of that carefully made soup, she promised herself never again to assume that quicker was better. I love this. You're going to pay attention to this little puppy. He's the cutest thing ever. He's just kind of like taking a look at this tear soup like, what in the world are we doing? Because of her great loss, Grandy knew this time her recipe for tear soup would call for a big pot. With a big pot, she would have plenty of room for all of the memories, all the misgivings, all the feelings, and all the tears she needed to stew in the pot over time. So you can see here, you got the little the pans, right? If you can see, it says not fair, smallest, bad news, maybe a little bigger, big disappointment, a little bigger, serious heartache, and profound loss. Now we're getting really big, major tragedy, and then the biggest pot of all, more than I can bear. And if you look up here on the books at the top, you can see some of the losses that people could have, right? An unfaithful spouse, flunked geometry, a child died, losses of status, chronic illness, retirement. Wow, that's on there. Fatal diagnosis, a spouse died, infertility, near-death experience. So you see, there's just a multitude of different losses that we can have. And I think that Granny's, she's brewing up some tear soup for more than I can bear. She put on her apron because she knew it would get messy. It seems that grief is never clean. People feel misunderstood, feelings get hurt, and wrong assumptions are made all over the place. To make matters worse, grief always takes longer to cook than anyone wants it to. Isn't that the truth? Have you experienced that where it seems like people just want you to get over it? And then Grandy started to cry. At first she sobbed. Sometimes she wept quietly. Look at, she's over here on the left, and yet her tears are flowing freely, making puddles. And sometimes when she was in a safe place where no one could hear her, she even wailed. Again, you see the little puppy back there feeling really sad for his owner. Grandy knew she had to make much of this part of the soup alone. She learned from past experiences that most people don't like being around tears. Her friends would worry if they knew just how many tears Grandy's recipe called for this time. So the old and somewhat wise woman reflected on her own special recipe as she looked down into the large, overflowing pot of memories. It was a task she would repeat many times during the next few months. Grandy winced when she took a sip of the broth. All she could taste was salt from her teardrops. It tasted bitter, but she knew this was where she had to start, and for now, it was the only thing on her menu. Again, this is a deep book, so I'm hoping you're writing down a couple of things. People that are experiencing grief, this is a big one. They just need to put some time away for themselves. It's okay that this is one of the main things that they're focusing on, if not the only thing. There were things that Grandy never wanted to forget. These included the good times and the bad times, the silly and the sad times. Just basically pulling out the hope chest, right? It's got all the pictures and letters and all that kind of stuff. With her arms full of memories, Grandy made many trips to the kitchen. One at a time, she slowly stirred all of her precious and not so precious memories into the pot. But eventually, she ran out of things to add. Look at all the cupboards are open. I mean, she's been putting everything. Look at this little sign on the fridge. What does it say? When one person is missing, the whole world seems probably to stop. That's what it probably says. Grandy's arms ached as she felt stone cold and empty. There were no words that could describe the pain she was feeling. What's more, when she looked out the window, it surprised her to see how the rest of the world was going on as usual, while her world had stopped. Her grandson Chester, who just wanted his Grandy to be happy again, hoped his chocolate drops would make her feel better. Mrs. Bloomklotz, Miss Chadwick, and Mr. Long, all brave yet fearful neighbors, dropped by to see how Grandy was doing. They filled their air with words, but none of their words took the smell of tear soup away. Grandy was gracious because she knew how helpless her friends felt. They wanted to fix her, but they couldn't. All Grandy really needed from them at that moment was a knowing look and a warm hug. I hope you wrote that down because that's a huge one, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But how are we able to do that? All Grandy really needed from them at that moment was a knowing look and a warm hug. There were also days when Grandy hungered for a thoughtful ear. Sometimes she would ask total strangers, "Care to join me in a bowl of tear soup?" "No, thanks." Most people would reply, "I don't have time for tear soup today." Even some of Grandy's friends hurried past her house and pretended not to notice the aroma of tear soup coming through her open door. Grandy found that most people can tolerate only a cup of someone else's tear soup. The giant bowl, where Grandy could repeatedly share her sadness in great detail, was left for a few willing friends. "I'm here," Midge cried. "I got here as fast as I could, and I'll be here whenever you need me." "What a tragedy. I'm so sorry you're having to make such a big pot of soup." Oh, what a relief. Grandy knew she didn't have to be careful what she said around Midge. Midge wouldn't try to talk her out of anything she was feeling, and Grandy could even laugh and not worry that Midge would assume Grandy was over her grief. "Sorry I couldn't get here sooner," said Midge. "No problem," replied Grandy. "I've had plenty of help, but most of these friends will be history pretty soon. They'll be over my tragedy long before I am, but I know you'll still be around." "I don't know what to say, but I'll be glad to listen," Midge said tenderly. "Come on, tell me about it a while we make some bread to go along with your soup." These two friends, who had shared 1,000 laughs and just as many tears, pounded at the bread dough together. "I feel like I'm unraveling," Grandy cried. "I'm mad, I'm confused, I can't make any decisions, nobody can make me feel good, I'm a mess. I just didn't realize it would be this hard." "Why don't we go for a walk while we wait for the bread to rise?" Midge suggested. "I know exercise is supposed to help me, but I feel like I have concrete blocks strapped to my legs. We'd better not go too far or you'll have to carry me home," moaned Grandy. Miss Chrysalot called and reminded Grandy that she had been making tear soup for years and would be more than glad to come right over and show her how to make it the correct way. "Thanks, but no," said Grandy. "This pot has my name on it." Grandy knew better than to let Miss Chrysalot or anyone else tell her what she should do to get through this terrible loss. Next, her recipe called for some comfort food. For Grandy, this meant mashed potatoes or ice cream. Comfort food always makes you feel better, or at least for a little while. It gets past that big lump in your throat when other foods can't. I think it needs some chocolate too. After all, it was her soup. Even the dog gets some ice cream. How about that? Grandy kept attending worship, even though she was mad at God. Sometimes she yelled at God and asked why this happened, and sometimes she demanded to know where God was when she was feeling so all alone. Still, Grandy trusted God, but she didn't understand God. She sensed that people believed that if she really had faith, she would be spared deep sorrow, anger, and loneliness. Grandy kept reminding herself to be grateful for all the emotions that God had given her. It's a good message there, too. On some afternoons, people would ask questions like, "Is it soup yet?" Or, "How long is it going to take? You've been at this for over a month now. It's time to get out of the kitchen." Grandy fumed at the caller's advice. I love this picture too. She's got a sign up that says, "Do not disturb any further," and says, "Caution, you're entering a grief zone." And she's got her dog on guard. Grandy looked forward to getting the mail each day. She dreaded the day when no more sympathy cards would come. When she was alone and needed to think, she found it helpful to keep notes on her soup making. So if you read some of these notes, the top one there says, "Today I'm upset that I have to be making this soup." And the next one says, "I don't think anyone remembers that I'm making tier soup from scratch. What's the use? Life seems to be so hard." And then another note, "I'm beginning to like the taste of this soup. I think I could live on it forever." Haven't we ever felt that? Thank goodness Granny and Pops had been married a long time. They already knew each other's tier soup would be different. Secretly, Grandy wished Pops would put more flavoring in his soup, but he doesn't want to. And he's perfectly content to dine alone and sip his own soup. That's another very powerful message. Everybody grieves in different ways. And you can see he's got tears flowing from his eyes, and he's struggling just as much. Making tier soup is hard work. Sometimes it was all she could think about. Even the things Grandy used to love to do, she didn't have the energy for, nor did she care about it anymore. That sound like depression? Yeah. Some of Grandy's friends over the years had not tended to their tier soup. Their soup boiled over and the pot scorched. What a mess. It took them a long time to clean up their pots and to start over. The smell of burnt soup still lingers in some of their homes. Grandy knew there were times when she needed to take a break from her soup making. Even though it was hard to do, she forced herself to get away. Grandy heard that a neighbor was having to take her turn in the kitchen. Some people thought that the neighbor was eating too much tier soup. So, Grandy, being an old and somewhat wise woman, called and invited her to a special soup gathering where it's not bad manners to cry in your soup or have second helpings. I like this picture too. Instead of bring your own beer, it's bring your own soup. BYOS. Soon, the thoughtful cooks sat at Grandy's table and discussed the process of making tier soup. There are some parts that require help from friends, and some parts you just have to do alone. They shared stories about soup making they wouldn't dare tell anyone else for fear of being judged a bad cook. They all laughed knowingly when Grandy remarked how on days when she was daydreaming while driving, she was glad that the car seemed to know where she wanted to go. These people had become Grandy's new best friends. One day, as Grandy and Chester were going for a drive, Chester asked, "Mom says you've been making tier soup. What does she mean?" "Well, tier soup is a way for you to sort through all the different types of feelings and memories you have when you lose someone or something special. Remember when your baby brother died right before he was born and your mom sat for days holding his blanket and weeping? She was making tier soup. You made tier soup yourself by acting out your own disappointment when you shouted at Jason, wishing his brother would die too. Remember when Billy's dog died and he didn't want to play with you? Not feeling like having fun is one of the ingredients of tier soup also. And remember when Aunt Meg got divorced and they had to move? There was a lot of tier soup simmering in that house. Some days when you're making tear soup, it's even hard to breathe. Some days you feel like running away and you just hope a better day comes along soon. And then comes one of the hardest parts of making tear soup. It's when you decide it may be okay to eat something instead of soup all of the time. The next morning, as Grandy was cleaning up, Chester asked her if she was done making tear soup. Well, I don't think you actually ever finish. The hard work of making this batch of soup is almost done, though. I'll put the rest in the freezer and I'll pull it out from time to time and have a little taste. So what else have you learned about making tear soup, Grandy? I've learned that grief, like a pot of soup, changes the longer it simmers and the more things you put into it. I've learned that sometimes people say unkind things, but they really don't mean to hurt you. And most importantly, I've learned that there is something down deep within all of us ready to help us survive the things we think we can't survive. Grandy, you know so much. What will I do after you die? Don't worry. I will leave you my recipe for tear soup. All right. So thank you for letting me read that story to you. And I hope that there were some parts in there that really stuck with you as you work to help other people with grief or help yourself work through some grief. Were you able to find some of those key principles? Let's go over a few of them. So first, when you're going through something difficult or somebody's going through something difficult, this is their grief or your grief, no one else's. Your friends can't feel your loss in the same way. It will not affect your life in the way it affects yours. And honestly, you may resent them for that. Like I said earlier, grief is not a linear process. Again, it can be pretty messy, right? I like this little quote here. There's no rule book. There's no time frame. There's no judgment. Grief is an individual as a fingerprint. Do what's right for your soul. I like this other one too, is try your best to communicate and educate your friends about what you need and how they can help. And then just be honest as you can about how you're feeling. The reality is that a lot of people just don't know how to deal with people struggling with grief. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. Don't give up on your friends if they let you down. But if you continue to be but if they continue, is what I want to say, to your grief, you may need to distance yourself for a while until you get stronger. And I'm a firm believer in this. Find 1 to 2 people whom you can count on for the long haul to just be there and listen when you need to talk. So maybe I'll just kind of give this really quick example from my own life. So when I had just gotten married, this is probably, 15 years ago or so, my wife got pregnant and then she ended up having a miscarriage. And I was really sad about that. I was really bummed about that. But my wife was probably rightfully so more impacted because not only is she impacted emotionally, but I also think that, she's the one carrying the baby. I just think it was a much bigger thing for her. And I remember that, she had to go and go to the doctor and get it removed because she just didn't have it, it didn't come out on its own. And so, I just remember one thing that I learned through that experience is that a lot of people, if not most people, they don't know how to deal with people's grief. And it's no fault, it's not a condemnation, it's just a fact. There were numerous people that came up to my wife after this as she was struggling immensely, and they would say things like, "Oh, do you know, I'm sorry you had a miscarriage. You know that it's pretty normal when you're first trying to get pregnant. And, it's like a 20% chance that you're going to get, I don't know what the percentage is exactly, but it's like 10 or 20% chance that you're going to have a miscarriage on your first try anyway. So it's totally normal. Was that helpful? No, not helpful. Or, oh, you can just get pregnant again. I'm sorry that happened, but you'll be okay. I know it's just a lot of these kind of trite statements that were just not helpful. Or even, I even think sometimes worse yet, they would say, oh, sorry you had a miscarriage. And then they would talk about how they had a miscarriage. Oh, I had a miscarriage once, and this is what happened to me. And then, for the next 5-10 minutes, they're talking about their experience, which may or may not have anything, it may not resemble my wife's experience. And then it even gets worse. So then she goes to the doctor to get what they call this, D&C. I'm not sure what that exactly stands for, but basically it's a vacuum, right? That they kind of make sure that they get everything out of there. And one of the nurses actually referred to it as dusting and cleaning the D&C. And probably, again, she's trying to minimize the seriousness of it or whatever her reasoning. She wasn't trying to be insensitive, but it was extremely insensitive. So had all these experiences like this, right? My wife's really struggling. And then across the street from our home was a family that we had known for a long, long time. My parents had known them. This is a house that I ended up growing up in. So I knew this family for a long time. And then I bought the house from my parents. So anyway, so this person we had known them for a long time. And she became aware of what had happened to my wife. And so I kid you not, this was the most powerful thing that could have happened during this time for my wife and I. So this woman, she came over, she literally just walked over to our house. She walked over to the house. And I remember this so clearly, I believe it was on a Sunday even. She came over to the house. She opened, she knocked on the door. My wife opened the door. And all she did was, she said, I am so sorry this has happened to you, and gave my wife a big hug. That's it. And I think she brought over some soup as well. And she just listened. She says, I'm here for you. Just let me know how I can help. And if nothing else, I'll just be here with you. And that's all she did. That is all she did. And it was so healing for my wife to have one person that did that for her. So coming back to what I just said before, find a couple of people that can just be there for you, listen to you, and let you talk and share your feelings. I put these on here because, a lot of people work through grief on their own, but if it's usually sustained for a significant amount of time, you're really struggling, or somebody's really struggling getting through something over a long period of time, and I don't know what that time is exactly, but be open to some counseling, talking to a therapist, processing things, finding a safe place to be able to share your feelings where you're not being judged, and that maybe just kind of a listening ear could be really helpful, especially if you don't have people in your life that you feel like you can do that to. There are support groups out there for grief and loss, and those could be really beneficial, just like what Grandy did, right? She started getting some other people that were that had some of their own struggles, and there's a reason why there's support groups, guys. It's because they are impactful and they are effective. So keep that in mind. If you're really struggling, open yourself up to the idea of going to a group or seeing a therapist. And I always tell people that they should go at least a few times before they make a decision to not go, because it is going to be something different. It's maybe something you're not used to. So maybe your immediate reaction was like, oh, that was too hard, or that was too uncomfortable, and then I'm not going to go. But you'd get the benefit, and you'd really get a better idea if it's going to be helpful if you went a few times. All right, so what are some of the tips that came out of that story? Well, there's a lot. I'm going to choose to just focus on a few of them. And the truth is that this book, if you choose to get it, it actually has, and I took a lot of the things that I put down here from the book, but it does have at the end of the book ideas for if you're the cook, meaning you're the one struggling with the loss, or if you have a friend that's the cook, or if you have a child that's the cook, and kind of how to help people on their journey, or help them through this, through whatever they're struggling with. So here's a few of them. Write your thoughts in a journal. So, just to help you process through difficult things. I believe that our bodies and minds are set up to heal, and sometimes they just need some help to get things moving. So if you have a traumatic event and that turns into PTSD, I think a really good way of looking at it is your brain and even your body is having a real hard time sort of making sense of that trauma, right? Like the example of being assaulted, or being in some violent crime or something, and now you're struggling with feeling safe and hyper vigilant and all that. It's because all along, you've been living these years and years of feeling safe and you can trust people and all this, and then that gets kind of thrown on its head, and so that gets kind of stuck in your brain. Like your brain is having a hard time making sense of that event, and so it sort of comes out in flashbacks and intrusive thoughts, and a lot of times, especially when it comes down to trauma, what happens is people take that negative event, whatever it was, and they extrapolate it as something negative about themselves. I'm going to say that one more time. So they take that negative event, whatever it is, and they extrapolate it as something negative about themselves. I am weak. I should have known better. Why didn't I see this coming? Those kind of things, right? And so again, because your brain is having a hard time processing it, then it's coming out in some really dysfunctional ways. I believe that, so think about it in this context. If you get a cut on your arm, our bodies are set up to heal that cut, right? It sends the resources, the antibodies, whatever it needs to do to start healing that cut right away. Our brains are no different. Whenever we experience something difficult or we have even some stress, right? We talked about stress quite a bit. When we're faced with a stressful situation, our body and our mind, right? They what's the word I want to use? They rally the troops, rally the resources, right? And with the cortisol and the adrenaline and all that to manage that thing. So I believe it's the same thing with grief and loss. It can be hard and it takes time, but writing your thoughts in a journal, that's just one way of sort of helping your brain process through some of those difficult things. So I think that's maybe an underutilized coping skill that would really help us out, is just writing in a journal. I really like this one too. Exercise, sleep, drink plenty of fluids, and eat a well-balanced diet. I mean, that seems pretty simple, right? But really, I mean, this is a stressful situation. I mean, you're dealing with something that's extremely difficult. You want your body and your brain working at peak efficiency to kind of help you work through these things. I love how this, her Midge, Grandy's best friend, what did she do? She said, hey, while the bread is rising or it's in the oven, why don't we go take a walk? That was a very wise friend, because there is something about walking, even just mild exercise, that helps calm the brain. It probably helps us think clearly. Some of you may have heard of like EMDR, eye movement desensitization relaxation. But just, one of the key components of EMDR is what they call bilateral stimulation, right? So they'll like put their finger, and then you kind of go back and forth and you follow their finger with your eyes. And it doesn't even have to be with your finger. They can do what they have, like light bars where, you follow a light that goes back and forth. They even have something called TheraTappers, where you have these, you hold on to these two things in both hands, and they kind of buzz back and forth from one hand to the next hand. That's called bilateral stimulation. And so there's the belief is, and there's a lot of research about this. The belief is that when you're doing you're stimulating your brain bilaterally, it helps you process through things, and so it can be really effective for trauma and things like that. Well, guess what you're doing when you're walking? You're using bilateral stimulation, right? One foot on one, you're moving one foot, then the other, and that probably helps stimulate your brain, kind of helps you kind of work through things. Pretty cool, right? Maybe we should just get into our cars and turn the windshield wipers on. That'll help us process things better. I don't know. I'm just kidding. But just the idea, though, of just walking, I think, really kind of helps calm the mind and helps us process things. Another thing that I really liked in the story with Tear Soup is that she said, you know, I'm going to take some comfort food, right? And for her, you guys remember what it was? It was ice cream and mashed potatoes. So what's your comfort food? It's not, you know, obviously everything in moderation, but it's not a big deal to, gosh, go get your favorite ice cream, eat your favorite chocolate, or get a massage. Go to some of your favorite places, do some of the things that you really enjoy doing. Those are things that can really help us. Maybe I like what she said. It's maybe not a long-term solution because it may just sort of temporarily sort of lighten the load a little bit, but it can help, right? And what we're looking for is things to kind of help us get through things and move through them. Don't be too hard on yourself. I like this. You deserve to feel happy again. Being happy doesn't mean you forget. That kind of was said before too. I really like the statement that Grandy said about Midge. She said something along the lines of, I know that I can laugh and be happier for a moment in front of Midge, and she won't think that I'm over my sadness or I'm over my grief. I think that's really important. It's okay to feel happy. It's okay to be, that having a good day. It doesn't mean that you're forgetting about things or you're not giving the right amount of attention to it. And I like this too. It's a process. It takes time. Learn to be grateful for the good days because you obviously know that you're going to have some bad days. This is important to remember. As long after everyone else has forgotten your loss, you'll continue to remember. Learn to be content with your private memories. I think that kind of goes to a level of what we often call as mindfulness, right? Just kind of being okay with ourselves and what's going on inside of us, and kind of having those memories, what they mean to us. Doesn't mean that always other people have to have those, or that they may not be remembering them or whatever, but just knowing that it's okay that we have them. Okay, so a couple things with if we have a friend that's struggling, I kind of already did say a couple things on this, but essentially be there for your friend even when you don't understand what they're going through. Be a source of comfort. Just like that neighbor, just listen. It's okay. She said this woman cried with my wife, and she just sat with her and just listened to how disappointed my wife was. And she didn't try to minimize it. She didn't try to, get her through it or anything. She just wanted to be there with her while she was struggling with this. What I meant to say there is allow them to grieve in their own way. Sorry, I put all. Call your friend. Don't worry about being a bother. Sometimes we do that, right? Oh, I'm just going to give them their space. Well, maybe they need somebody. And don't worry about being a bother. Let your friend tell you if they don't want to talk about their loss right now. Let them set those boundaries. Otherwise, a lot of times that's exactly what they need. Just like what what Grandy needed. She needed just a good friend to come and be able to just chat with her. Give your friend permission to grieve in front of you. Don't change the subject or tell them not to cry or act uncomfortable when they don't cry. Obviously, with the holidays coming up, guys, even for those of us who have worked through sadness and loss or grief in our lives, these are the times of year when a lot of times these are the things, our losses come up, right? And I would encourage us to share those feelings with others openly and let them know that, hey, this is still something that is deep and close to our hearts. I think about my mom more than ever around the holidays. She loved Christmas. She loved Thanksgiving, and she loved all the get-togethers. And, I miss having my mom around during the holidays. And if you've lost a child or you've lost a loved one, and worse yet, if it happened to be around the holidays, those can be difficult times too. So just be mindful of those. And it might be good to, again, it's okay to kind of bring those things up, especially if you know your friend well and you know that they've struggled with this in the past. It's okay to just bring it up, say, hey, how you doing? Wasn't it about this time of year that you lost you're not going to bring up something they haven't already thought about, guys. You're just not. Ask the questions, but don't tell people how they should feel. So just so we're not going to go over these, but you can see that these are some of the pages at the end of that book. Grandy's cooking tips. Is there anything on there that I didn't really say? I like that one. It says assumptions about fairness, life, order, and religious beliefs are often challenged when we have a big loss. Because grief is distracting, it also means we're more accident prone. So you got to be aware of that. I love the part, we kind of already said this, but the object of grieving is not to get over the loss or recover from the loss, but to get through the loss. And then lastly, over the years, you will look back and discover that this grief keeps teaching you new things about life. Your understanding of life will just keep getting deeper. Wasn't that beautiful at the end of the book where she had come to a level of peace, and she was teaching that grandchild of hers the things that she had learned through her life, and that I believe that boy is going to be very enriched by that experience in his own losses in the future. So, and I like how she said that grief and loss, it sort of changes over time, right? Because it's had a chance to simmer or sit, and it tends to change. And I can definitely say I'm in a different place with the loss of my mother than I am now. But it doesn't mean it doesn't still impact me. The last thing that I thought was super powerful in that story was I loved how she kept some of her tear soup in the freezer. I love that, because I believe that when we struggle with a loss, or we have a significant loss in our life, it's okay to remember those things, to remember those. And she even said the good times, the not so good times. It's okay to go there and reminisce on how much we miss that person. And so we can pull that tear soup every once in a while out and have a little, have a cry about it, and understand that that's, again, just part of the human condition. Just like that 90-year-old guy who said that it made him miss his, being at my mom's service made him miss his own mom. And like I said, there's, if you're the cook, which we went over some of those things, if your child is the cook, if your friend is the one making tear soup, if you're a male chef, it even has some about that. And if there's two of you that are cooking, like if you're dealing with this as a couple. So that's my presentation, guys. We're getting off just a couple of minutes early, but I'll leave it open for any questions if there's any questions for me. Yeah, if there's not, then that's what I've got.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this amazing presentation and to create new content for us. I knew that this was something that you created specifically for our participants, so I'm really appreciative. Um, I
You're
can just
welcome.
wait for questions, but while people are typing them in, I want to highlight our EAP program, Dear Oaks, and they offer 6 free counseling sessions per issue to county employees and people in your household. So I will put that in the chat box for you to check out. James, it looks like we're getting a lot of thank yous and people mentioning this was a beautiful presentation.
Well, thank you so much. That makes me feel good. I appreciate that.
And then I'll also put in the chat box in, sign in before now. And James, is it all right if we share your email if people have follow-up questions?
Absolutely. That'd be fine.
Okay.
And do you have that?
I believe so, but if you wouldn't mind just putting it in the chat box, that'd probably be easier because I think I have it in my contact list.
Chat box. Where is that? How do I find the chat box? Oh, there it is. Chat.
I usually find it in the right-hand corner,
Yeah,
but
I just
yours might
got.
look a little
Yep,
different.
got it.
Alrighty, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions, just lots of thank yous. And we're going to see you back next week about the myths and facts of seasonal affective disorder. Is that right?
Yes, that'll probably be me. I might, if it's not me, it'll be someone else. But yeah, we'll help you out for sure.
Wonderful, thank you. Oh,
Okay.
perfect.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Bye bye.